much. Thank you, David. And I'm a huge fan of the work you've done with One to One, and also the way you've brought so many different refugee community organizations, Jewish and beyond the Jewish community, together to sort of support one another, and to really, really appreciate what you and your family and your team have done. And Lord Finkelstein, if I may, Daniel, I hope that's okay.
Of course,
Your
Daniel,
family has
yes.
been part of our community. I mean, your sister particularly, I once, through when she was chair of our synagogue, I think I joked to you that she could run the country with one hand and run the synagogue with the other, and I wasn't sure which was the more challenging. I really, really appreciate your family. And I remember, your parents, particularly your mother, of whom you write so lovingly in this book. And it's a masterpiece. It's powerful in so many ways. It's powerful because it's deeply personal. It's powerful because into the narrative of your mum and dad, it's a fantastic title. You incorporate so many of the decisive events between the 30s and the mid 40s. And also because, as well as telling the narrative on your mother's side, which may be perhaps less unfamiliar to people, Germany, Amsterdam, Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, and that extraordinary exchange, very few people are as aware of the history in the East, of the Soviet role and Siberia and the war, and that side is really important. The first question I wanted to ask you is, why now? Was there something particular that motivated you to, it's presumably years of research, but something motivated you to do this work and to put it out there into the world now?
So first of all, Rabbi Jonathan, thank you very much. And I've written a book about two parents who respected you greatly, and a family that is very connected to you and gains a lot out of the Judaism that we share, and I've always been made very welcome at your synagogue. So first of all, thank you for that. The answer is, I suppose the first place to start is I went to see my mother give various talks on her story, and I remember going to see her talk at my boys' school in Watford Grammar, and she was really quite ill by that point, and I realized that it was probably the last one, as indeed it turned out to be the last one that she was going to give. And I knew that I saw the reaction of the boys to my mother talking, which was complete silence while people were listening to her story, and I realized it was something valuable and something that was about to be lost, and I would do my level best to try to do my duties to replace that. And that was one of the motivations for doing it. But I'm afraid there were also two quite prosaic practical reasons. One is I acquired an agent, and I did that in order to help David Cameron write his memoirs. And when those were finished, I kind of felt embarrassed that I wasn't giving Toby any other work. And so I talked to him quite a lot about it, and he shaped and suggested that I write this particular book. I gave him several different ideas. And the other reason, another practical reason, was COVID. It meant that I wasn't doing so many meetings. Now, the reason I mention those two things, the agent thing may be of use to people contemplating themselves writing books, because it's very valuable to it. The COVID thing is just to realize that an awful lot of things happen that you do in life when you should be doing things that are more important, but you do things that are more urgent. And what happened during COVID is that I refocused on the things that were important rather than the things that were urgent. And this book was important to me. I'm really happy that I concluded it, and I'm pleased that I got the time to do it, even though it meant that I wasn't doing a lot of other, pressing, but ultimately less fruitful things.
I'm curious because people asked me after I'd written my book on my father's family's narrative during the Holocaust. They said, did you feel, was it painful? Was it very difficult? I actually felt sort of compelled somehow. I'm wondering how you felt during the process of research and writing, and what that stirred for you.
Actually, the primary feeling I had was quite different to that. A few people have asked me that question. the main thing I had was this immense sense of connection to
Mm,
relatives that
yeah.
I didn't. Mum and dad, I had a sense of connection with anyway, but it was nice to kind of be reminded of them the whole time and watch their videos and have a sort of work reason for spending time with those. But there are many characters in my book, in particular my grandmother Greta and my grandfather Dolu, my father's father and my mother's mother, whom I didn't really know, and I do now. I gained them as people. That is immensely satisfying. But I can't say there were not points which were not even a bit, but quite distressing. One was understanding what happened in Sobibor. So just for those of people who haven't read the book, my mother and my immediate family are in Belsen, and this is because Himmler has decided to set up Belsen as an exchange camp. And as an exchange camp, it meant that if you had some documentation that suggested you could be of some hostage value to the Germans, they might keep you from the gas chambers. But my great aunt Nutti, my great aunt and my great uncle Jan, and my mother's cousin Fritz, they didn't have these documents, which my mother had, which we may talk about in a minute, but and therefore they went to Sobibor, and understanding what happened to them in Sobibor, that was unquestionably, that was distressing.
Yeah. No, what you say about gaining relatives whom you didn't know fully, I really relate to. There's the phrase, Dovev siftei yeshenim. You give speech, the lips of those who lie in the dust come back to life. And I think that's an important responsibility of people of our generation.
So it's a great satisfaction to me that Greta in particular, my mother's mother, who really was, I think it's plain, a completely wonderful person.
She seems totally selfless in that she managed to bring the family to the border to Switzerland and keep going then for them, and then she dies almost immediately. Yeah.
But you know, her both intellectually, when with her PhD in economics at a time when women didn't really do such things, and in terms of her partnership with my grandfather on the library, and also in her kind of gentle personality as a mother, those things all suggest she was a completely wonderful person. And I get great pleasure out of making sure that she is now known. I have to admit, this is a really terrible thing. She's called in this book Greta, and this is because when I went through her correspondence, I realized that though we always thought of her as Margareta, she called herself Greta, and she, in her letters and in anything informal, she calls herself Greta. Her name is actually spelt Margareta without an H, and yet it is common, because that's the most common spelling. It was common for her name to be spelt with an H in all sorts of documents, including one of the biographies of my grandfather, including exhibitions at the Wiener Library. So little was was known about her that even the very spelling and pronunciation of her name was no longer known. To bring that to be able to rescue that, to rescue her as a person, has been very satisfying to me.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Just on sticking with that side of your family, your mother's side, I hadn't not connected your family with the Wiener Library and with your grandfather. And that was one of the revelations of reading your book, and also how, you know, his devotion to documentation and how that got preserved and brought to London just in time. You know, I hadn't known that part of the story. But you describe how he goes to Zurich, is it Zurich, to Switzerland, for the trial of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And you write that he believed in truth. And a book like yours, as well as a family testament, is also a testament to the reality of what happened. And one of the worries is what narratives will go forward into history, and will they be truths or will they be falsehoods? And so that comment about believing in the truth really struck me, and I wanted to actually ask you whether this is part of your desire to affirm the truth, and whether in this age of false truths and alternative narratives, that can be upheld. After all, the protocols were condemned as a falsehood, but it's made very little dent on their impact into the world.
Yes. So I begin the book with this sentence, truth lies at the feet of liberty. This is actually just a description of a practical thing, which is that when my mother and her sisters are arriving in New York, having been released from Belsen, the war is still going on. They've been part of a very rare exchange. One of the things that they were worried about was that they might be treated as spies because they had my grandfather's First World War medals. They kept these medals in order that they would be useful in the camps. Actually, it is possible that they were of some use. But then Ruth gets the feeling that it might not be a good idea to bring them in through Ellis Island, and it's decided to throw them off the side of the boat by the Statue of Liberty, which is where they lie. So that is why the truth about my grandfather lies at the feet of liberty.
Yeah.
By the way, they were right to be worried about this. This was actually a concern that these people who were on exchanges would turn out to be spies. So they made a decision. And my grandfather was a bit upset about it because he didn't like the idea of both the truth and his Germanness being denied. But I still obviously think that sort of, I can understand it, although I think it probably shows a bit of a lack of imagination. Anyway, the book plays with this idea of truth. I've decided to write a book that is all story. So you have to bring these themes out for yourself, but certainly for me, my grandfather's interest in the truth is very important. On the one hand, his commitment to the truth was both incredibly laudable. It was a very brave campaign against the Nazis in the 1920s. It was suing the protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was encountering the publishers of the protocols. It was encountering Goering, who tells him to destroy the truth of his library. It was redoing it in Holland, bringing it to London, working with the intelligence services, helping Nuremberg, helping the Eichmann trial. So it was an incredibly laudable thing. And ultimately, it is vindicated in the post-war era. Maintaining the truth of the Holocaust has been very important. And if you contrast that with my father's experience, where the truth has been continually denied and ignored, you can see how vital to the shaping of world events the assertion of truth has been. But at the same time, the book is also clear, my grandfather's faith in the truth met with its counter in Hitler. Hitler manipulated the truth. Ultimately, and this is an irony I don't bring out, but is not very much not lost on me, the only reason my mother escapes being killed in the Holocaust is because of a gigantic lie, which is that she was a Paraguayan citizen, and therefore is allowed to be part of the exchange I talked about earlier. So the book it plays with this idea of liberty and truth and their relationship. I retain in my career and in my desire to write this book, a strong believer. My grandfather was right about truth's power, but you can't just, read about his life or my mother's life or my father's life and think it was satisfactory. You can't establish the truth merely by stating it, and you can't retain the truth merely by pointing out that it is truth. But trying to defend, you may be required to defend the idea of truth with arms. Ultimately,
but I think that dedication to the truth, and also the telling of stories around truth, the narrative, is extremely important, and the weaving of that into personal lives gives it a real body and soul, and that's extremely important in our time. Just staying with your mother's family, I want to ask you shortly about the research on the other side of your the other side of your family. You note that your grandfather regretted the fact that he had lost his First World War German medals. Now, yes. I grew up in a family where both sides fled Germany, but were very proud of their role in the First World War, in Weimar Germany, and that kind of paradox of still loving things German. And yes. I couldn't get my head around it. And I wonder if you've managed to get your head around it.
Yes, absolutely. Look, first of all, why they all fought in the First World War enthusiastically. It was not just an assertion of their Germanness, but also, of course, Jews were frightened of Russia. One of the things that I learned from the other side of the family, my grandmother and many members of my family flee Lvov for Vienna when the Russians arrive, right? Because they think Jews are not safe in Lvov. They're much safer in Vienna. So the first thing is that's one reason. But the other reason is, yes, my grandfather believed very much in that Germanness and Jewishness were tied together. He believed in a German Jewish culture. And so somebody said, he believed that Germans and Jews could live together. It wasn't that. He believed that being a German Jew, that's a bit like chicken soup. That joke about how you can tell someone's Jewish is because they say chicken soup. They don't say chicken soup. They say chicken soup. My grandfather had German Jew the same way. So he very passionately believed in that and fought for it. And indeed, he wasn't a Zionist for that reason. And when he dies, even though he does come round to the existence of the state of Israel, because I think it becomes a physical necessity, but when he dies, he asks for his eulogy to be in Hebrew and German.
Yeah.
So he regards himself as, right at the end of his life, a German Jew.
Yeah, and I grew up with a very similar sense of the German Jewish symbiosis and that belief in culture, which was very very central. I wanted to come to the other side of your family, your father's family. And first I wanted to ask you whether it was difficult to research, because you have a very, very great deal of detail. And I'm curious, how did you come by that? Did you have that in family letters and narratives, or did you have to go to authorities and archives? And what was that like?
Okay, so I had sort of four or five different sources. So one of them was that the Association of Jewish Refugees has kept an amazing archive of testimony, video testimony, and my father gave a 4-hour-long video.
Oh, right.
Which was amazing and gave me lots of detail, without which I think it would have been quite difficult. I had interviewed him as a journalist once and I'd taken a lot of notes, but so I would have had that, but this was much more detailed and granular, and Bayer Lepkovitz did an amazing job for the association.
He's terrific. And the AJR, terrific organization.
Well, yeah, it really, really is. So first of all, there was that. The second source was a group of letters that were sent by my grandmother's siblings who were living in Lvov, what became Lviv. The Russians have invaded. So just to give the background here, the Russians have invaded with their side of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. That's the sort of eastern Poland. They've taken over the city of Lviv. They arrest my grandfather for being a capitalist. They send him to the Gulag. They deport his family to Siberia, but they leave behind some other members of the family who then set out sending food parcels to my grandmother and my father. And you can do that because although they were deported, they were theoretically free people. They weren't actually in prison. There was no sentence. They just had to live where they were sent, which was Siberia. So they get sent this food, and with it are about 90 letters. And these are not hugely descriptive, but they were very important in helping me fill out what happened to them in that year. Then after the war, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has collapsed and the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union, there's then correspondence. This is the third source of about 30 letters that exist. Maybe even more than that took place in the Soviet Union after, when they're sort of reuniting with the Anders army, and that was also very helpful. And then the final source, and this is very important to anyone listening who contemplates doing their own book on their family. Anything that happens to your family has happened to someone else. If your family member has been on a train, or they have been to a city, or they have been put in a gulag, well, they're not the only person. Which means that your research material is not just the specific things from your family, but the memoirs and research done by everybody else who was there at the same time. So if, for example, you know that, as I do, that my grandfather was pulling logs to the river as a job, a mule, in a work gang, which my father did say, a description that lasted 2 lines, However, lots of people were given that job, so you can find out exactly what it constituted of and give people a full description of the experience that everyone who did that had. And that is a very important part of it. So I throughout the book, it's one of the techniques that I used to make this book as full as I could was to consult the memoirs of other people in exactly the same situation. So let me give you another example. My aunt and my mother have different recollections of what kind of train they were on, whether it was a goods train, a cattle train, or a passenger train, between different
Going to
destinations.
Switzerland.
And this was I knew the train to Switzerland was almost certainly a passenger train, but there was a train that was between Westerbork and Belsen, and there was also a train that was between Amsterdam and Westerbork. What were those cattle trains? Were they passenger trains? Well, both my mother and my aunt are no longer alive. They've given this recollection. How am I supposed to find out? Well, the answer was, because I knew the date and the kinds of trains that they were, you can find out who else was on those trains, and one of them might have described the train. And as it turns out, a man had written a privately published book called From Belsen to Buckingham Palace, and he had been on the same train as my mother from Westerbork, from Amsterdam to Westerbork, and he hadn't actually been on it, but he had seen and described in his memoirs the exact train my mother was on between Westerbork and Belsen, and I was able therefore to solve the problem. So that is the fourth set of, so as well as the correspondence, as well as the interviews, there was this source, which was everybody else's recollections of the same thing.
And that's, I found, as I knew my father had gone with his family, fled from Trieste to Haifa, and I was able to find some boating buff who could tell me the ship they were on and the menu for it. So it's extraordinary what is out there.
Yes.
The letters in German, what language, and was it difficult? I mean, many people have letters which they struggle to decipher. Was that a problem for you, or?
So German was not so much of a problem. Not that I can speak German. My father, interestingly enough, though he could speak 9 languages, and my mother could speak 3, and they didn't really encourage me very much in my language. They wanted me to be British, really, I think, and speak English. But so I don't have that language. But with German, particularly because a lot of my mother's material was typed, it was possible to optical character read them, to put them into search engines, to establish which documents had interesting things in them, and then to get them translated in the Wiener Library helped me with that. But the Polish was much more difficult, because all these letters I talked about with my grandmother, the ones in the envelope, they were all in Polish.
Right.
They could have been in German, actually. It's quite right. Everyone did speak German, and some early correspondence between various members of the family is in German, but their correspondence between Dolu and Lucia, between my grandfather and my grandmother, are all in Polish, and between her siblings and her, they're all in Polish. But Polish is impossible to read. Even you couldn't read a handwritten Polish letter and type it in to a search engine. I had to have someone translate these. Fortunately, lots of Poles feel correctly that nobody much knows about their experience, and I've had lots of support from the Polish community for this research, and this included a very nice family who called the Amanskas, who live in America now, and they translated these letters. And then in London, a woman called Susanna Soika, who was also, her parents had a similar experience. She didn't know anything about it, so she treated these letters, these facts, as something that would tell her all about it. And so I had them to translate it, and that was incredible.
And the fate of Poland, the Polish officers, you refer several times to Katyn and what happened there. One feels deeply sorry for the country, and the way your father's family epitomized so much of its fate during the war and after.
Yeah, look, lots of Jews talk, and I think this is not an unreasonable thing about anti-Semitism in Poland, and actually a similar thing in Ukraine, but particularly in Poland. And there's no question, and I'm completely frank about that, there was such anti-Semitism. But then I think I don't want also the kind of terrible experience of the Poles, or also the heroism of some Poles to be overlooked. So I think maybe this book acts as a sort of, as a bit of a redress of that, or a repositioning of that whole story. Stalin set out to destroy the Polish elite, and the way that I put it is the Nazis and the Soviets both had this kind of anti-elite idea. The Nazis, the fascist idea was, it's all Jews. The communist idea was it's all the upper class. So and the bourgeoisie, and the Nazis set about killing all the Jews, some of whom were shopkeepers, and the Soviets targeted all the shopkeepers, some of whom were Jews. And this is, what then happens to my family. I think that we should recognize that Stalin's project was the destruction of Poland. And so you cannot be anything other than somewhat irate about the attempts to kind of suppress history of the Holocaust and its writing, sometimes in Poland, or to kind of edit it. I do at the same time understand the upset in that country about the way that it's sometimes seen as, a kind of the main collaborator, when in fact it was really the victim of a lot of what happened in that period.
And you're very clear that when questions of responsibility, I don't think particularly because with Poland got discussed, your mother would quietly say the Nazis were responsible.
Yes, that's good that you raised that. So for people who haven't read the book, that I raised this question when a man called Kurt Zelenziger, who worked for my grandfather, he was working in the Amsterdam office of my grandfather's archive. My grandfather takes the library to London because it's thought to be...
This is the Wiener Library, what became the Wiener Library, yeah.
Because it's thought to be undermining the neutrality of the Dutch. But Kurt Zelenziger wants the library to remain open in Amsterdam, completely impractical thing financially and politically, but nevertheless he wanted it. And one of the things that he does as a result of that, almost certainly, it's disputed the exact facts, but almost certainly he holds back the visas that are sent for the staff that might have allowed them to escape. And this is only discovered once the Nazis have invaded and the route for escape is cut off. And Zelenziger then dies in Belsen, as do various, and various other members of staff also die through the Holocaust. And the question is, to what extent is that Zelenziger's fault? And my mother's claim was, well, lots of people made mistakes under tremendous pressure. But the fault belongs with the Nazis, and it's very important not to blame the victims.
And remember, while I had the support of my close and much missed friend, David Cesarani, while I was working on writing my family's history. And one of the things which I really remember, which he said, is never judge people in the past with the light of retrospect. It's just not fair, and it can be cruel. And I think that's a real point that you've made there.
Absolutely.
Just on the detail of your research, I want to actually come to the sort of the personality and character of your parents, which is amazing. But one of the most chilling passages in your book is when you've researched what happened to the Jews in every house number in Eichstraat in Amsterdam.
Yes.
And you list to which concentration camp they're going. I'm going to ask you that question, then one or two more, and there will be a few minutes for questions if people want to put them in the Q&A. We've got a few more minutes to go. Just how did you do that research? And that's one of the most chilling passages.
Yeah, thank you. So that information is publicly available, and I came across it while I was. So I did a chapter called The Joy and Glee Club, and I followed all the children who belonged to a little sort of play club that my aunt Ruth, who was like 12 or 13 when this happened, she had set this up, and I followed each of the people on the membership list to find out what happened to them. And while doing that, I stumbled across what had happened to everyone on the street. And there's a website that simply has, all the people that died in Amsterdam, and you can organize it by address. So I sort of thought to do that. And when I did it, it's really jumped
Oh
out
my
at me.
goodness.
My goodness. It
Absolutely.
happens in almost every house. So I thought, you know what will be powerful is just list it. And and it's interesting that you say that, because lots of people have said to me that was a very much the powerful. Nick Robinson, the broadcaster, said to me, broke down in tears, and that was one of the most powerful things in it. So yeah, what I wanted to try to do in this book was to attach the great force of history to real people. Okay, so there have been two types of book on the Holocaust, and on sort of the Soviets, there've been less literature, but even there, one of which is history books, which are just the history of everything that happened, and the other of which is personal memoirs. What happened to me? You know, what happened to my family? What happened to my friends? And what I was trying to do here was to see whether I could create something else, which was a book in which everything that in history is connected to the individuals. And that was helped because my grandfathers in particular were such extraordinary people in public life. And that meant that I could connect what they were doing to broader historical themes.
You very much succeeded. It's the triumph of the book. And it's extremely important because it's that connection between personal narrative and the great events that shape their destinies that I think will go forward as the record of history, more perhaps than purely factual books and more than individual stories. So I think this is really, really significant. And thank you. One more question, then I'm going to see if people have things they want to put in the chat or ask you.
The Q&A, I think they're supposed to put it in.
The Q&A. Your parents, I mean, you say this more about your mother than I mean, so you write about your mother, but I think it's true of your father as well. And I also remember the words said by your sister, by Tamara, at the Shiva for your mother, which is, you know, the ability to continue to live life in a positive and calm manner with what comes across as a very limited amount, if any, of bitterness. And that's the most remarkable human achievement. And I just wanted to touch base with that and ask you, you know, is that indeed so? And how do you understand that?
So really, that is an exceptional feature of my parents, really. And it's what means that anybody who reads this can say, well, look, this book has got, you know, they do travel through this, you know, what I say, there's a detour through hell from their happy childhood to their adulthood. But they lived a very happy life for 54 years. And one of the reasons they lived a very happy life, the married life for 54 years, apart from their relationship with each other, was that they were determined they weren't going to let what happened to them spoil it, even though they knew they could. So, you know, nobody had more claim than my parents to be victims. They were victims, and being a victim had a lot of power. In my mother's case, for example, I remember her even saying to me once, people almost think we're saints, you know, and us Holocaust survivors, when of course we're just ordinary people. But she was determined not to let that be who she was, or let that be a description of her life. She wanted to live, and to her children to live. She didn't like the idea of a second generation, for example. That's not to say she didn't want me to tell the story, but she didn't want me to live it. She wanted me to, you know, be doing the things that I do in my life, enjoy myself, and not allow Hitler and Stalin to spoil it. And that was an act of will on their part, and very impressive it was too. I'm very lucky that they chose that route. It's partly personal resilience, partly a bit age. You know, if you look at what happened to for example, Dolu and Lusha, it was hard. That's my father's mother and my father's mother and father. It's harder for them to start again. You know, my grandfather arrives here. He's like he was 57 by the time he arrived in this country. My grandmother was 47, something like that. And so, you know, it was just, for them, it was harder. But nevertheless, my mother and father made the best of the fact that they were young and they could rebound from it, and they really did.
Yeah, I think it's the penultimate sentence in the book. Love has conquered hate.
Yes.
a very stirring conclusion. And it feels that they and you and your families have really borne that out.
Thank you.
How have, when I published my book, my children didn't know that history of the family, and they read it, and then they asked me questions about it, and there was a whole kind of dramatis personae because my father died when they were quite young, and they didn't know him well, and his side of the family really at all. So nobody's put anything in the Q&A yet, so I'm keeping going. How has this been received by your children and your brother and sister's children in the next generation? What impact do you think it has on them as part of their legacy?
Yeah, so undoubtedly it's meant that they have all got a sort of version of the family story that they can relate to and they can pass on. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote it. It was to kind of bottom out turn every kind of loose anecdote into a proper history and describe what happens. And I've done the research now to help them, and they all really enjoy it. My oldest son, made quite a contribution to the book. He enjoyed it as a literary exercise, but also a historical one. And he went through he's still doing it, actually, going through every passage and every reference, and really participated in it and connected, I think, a lot with his great-grandparents and with his grandparents. My youngest son sort of got very special needs, so it's more difficult for him to relate, but even he able to explain certain things. I remember the other day we had something that happened. My wife in Ocado, that what happens sometimes, they order, you get 3 times as much as you ordered because you clicked on it too many times, and we got loads of sardines, which I don't like, and I was unpacking them, and I was explaining to my 16-year-old, this is the one that is my youngest one who has special needs, and I said the other person who really liked sardines was your great-grandfather Dolu. He really liked them, and I explained to him how I knew that, because my father had packed sardines when they thought they were going to be reunited with my grandfather. He'd been sent to the Gulag, and they packed sardines in case they saw him. And so to be able to make these little connections with their past, with their relatives, especially for someone who's less able to understand a big historical context, that's been very satisfying. And my sister's children have taken a great interest. They're doing presentations for next generation, and for them it's I think an opportunity to learn more. And I've got a very good relationship with my brother's children. One of them is in politics like I am, so we're professionally linked, and to be able to share the politics of that has been very, very valuable.
That'll give me a concluding question then, and then leave you in peace, and thank you, which is on the penultimate page, before Love Has Conquered Hate. You have a number of sentence beginning politics matters.
Yes.
It's a very interesting, kind of speaking between a rabbi and a politician. It's not my role to get involved in party politics, but I believe that Judaism is concerned with the public square, and polis means a city. So religion is inevitably concerned with politics in the sense of what values are animating our society and played out in the public square. So I would agree very much that politics matters. Yes. Is it that legacy that has motivated you and your nephew to become involved in the public square, in the values of the
my sister, as you know, she's also involved in public life.
Well, absolutely.
Definitely. I mean, definitely, and my brother too. So definitely. Look, first of all, I should say that some of the most moving discoveries was how much religion had meant to my family. And there's an amazing passage in there in which my aunt explains what.
Sorry, we lost you for a moment. I beg your pardon. So I was thanking you in absentia, and just saying that anybody who hasn't read this book should read it. It's really a masterpiece, and it goes to the heart of 20th century history, but also it is very germane to what's happening in Eastern Europe in our world today. And I really want to thank you for sharing this with us, for enabling us to have these insights and that knowledge, Lord Finkelstein. Thank you.
Well, Thank you very much indeed, Rabbi. And, you know, of all the people, my brother-in-law, Michael, suggested that you might be able to do this interview. And I thought, well, that would be absolutely wonderful. And so it proved. It's wonderful to have a dialogue with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Michael, am I back on?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Well, that was so powerful. And you know what I've just taken from both of you is that rescuing, in your words, rescuing their memory and contributing to the narratives that go forward into history is so important. And you know, we can all do that, I guess, individually, and we can all help others do that. I think of the refugees today, but and what you've done is you've attached the great force of history into real people, as Jonathan said. Everything is connected to the individual and their faith in the truth and liberty, which is the essence of hope. And in all the darkness in the world today, and gosh, we've seen some terrible stuff on our screens, but live in countries where we've worked, with the refugees that we've worked with. But in all that darkness, and it shines through in your book, Daniel, there always seems to be a sliver of light. And I think it's down to all of us to bring that light back into the world, and whether it's historical and, as you say, rescuing the memories, and taking inspiration, and that's certainly our experience in the work that we do. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about that work, then please be in touch with Danny or me, or Michael as well. Michael, thank you so much for arranging all of this tonight and for being our technical lifeblood for those who aren't as technical as perhaps we should be. So thank you so much to Lord Daniel and Rabbi Jonathan for the most wonderful evening, which I believe is recorded. And so if you want to track back on it or share it with friends, we have it in history now, and to take forward into the future.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the work you do. And thank you, Michael, for the opportunity. Thank you, Daniel.
And thanks everyone for joining us this evening, and perhaps see you next week for a different discussion on a different subject, but there's so many links in different ways. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.